In 1987, a botanist in New Zealand bought a hillside of dead, weed-choked farmland and announced a plan so strange that his neighbors called him a fool and a dreamer. While the entire country was spraying, burning, and bulldozing a hated invasive weed called gorse, he decided to do the opposite. He would let it grow, he would protect it, he would build an entire forest on top of it. The farmers were furious. The local council ordered him to keep clearing it. He refused. And what happened on that hillside over the next 35 years rewrote what scientists thought they knew about how to bring a forest back. To understand why letting a weed grow was such a radical act, you first have to understand what New Zealand had already lost. On the eastern coast of New Zealand's South Island sits Banks Peninsula, a rugged knot of ancient volcanic hills and deep bays jutting out into the Pacific near the city of Christchurch. 1,000 years ago, before humans arrived, this entire peninsula was cloaked in dense, unbroken native forest, from the shoreline all the way up to its highest peaks at over 800 meters. Nowhere else on Earth was there a forest quite like it. Having drifted in isolation for around 80 million years, New Zealand had given rise to plants and animals that evolved into forms found nowhere else on the planet. The peninsula's forests were a mix of towering podocarps, ancient conifers like totara and kahikatea, some of them centuries old, and southern beech draped in mosses and ferns. Beneath the canopy thrived an astonishing diversity of life. The reserve at the center of this story alone holds more than 60 different species of fern. Through the trees moved birds found only in New Zealand: the bellbird, the brown creeper, the native pigeon called the keriru, the fantail, and the falcon. For the Maori people, who had lived on the peninsula for centuries and called themselves its kaitiaki, or guardians, this forest was a source of food, materials, and identity. It was, by every measure, a complete and thriving ancient ecosystem. And in the space of a single century, almost all of it was destroyed. The clearing of Banks Peninsula was one of the most extreme deforestation events in New Zealand's history. When European settlers arrived in the mid-1800s, they looked at the peninsula's magnificent forests and saw two things: valuable timber and an obstacle to farming. The great trees were felled and fed into sawmills. Settlers like Francois Nabe, who claimed land in Otanerito Bay in the late 1850s, cleared the old-growth forest from entire valleys to convert them into pasture. Portable mills sprang up in the bays, devouring the magnificent beech and podocarp timber. Fire, however, was the fastest and most devastating tool of all. Settlers burned the forest on a massive scale to open up grazing land, and the fires often raged far beyond what anyone intended. By the mid-1880s, almost all of what is now this reserve had been scorched, logged, or burned in one way or another. Once the land was cleared, it was sown with an introduced pasture grass, Acaroa cocksfoot, and given over to sheep, cattle, and dairy farming. The scale of the catastrophe is hard to overstate. Of the continuous native forest that had blanketed the peninsula for thousands of years, well over 90% was wiped out. By the early 1900s, the forest cover had been reduced to scattered remnants clinging to the steepest, most inaccessible gullies. An ecosystem 80 million years in the making had been almost entirely erased in about 50 years. The destruction did not stop with the trees. As the forest disappeared, so did the creatures that lived within it. Around a dozen native bird species went locally extinct on the peninsula, and others retreated into the few remaining pockets of bush in remote wooded gullies. The bare, cleared hillsides eroded in the rain, and the runoff choked the waterways below. One lake, once an abundant source of eels and flatfish for the Maori who depended on it, was turned into a reservoir of phosphate-rich sludge by the sediment pouring off the deforested slopes. The Maori people of the area, who had been guardians of thousands of hectares, were left confined to tiny, uneconomic reserves, cut off from the food sources their culture depended on. And then there was the irony that would define this entire story. Having stripped the land bare for farming, the settlers and their descendants found themselves locked in a permanent war against a new invader: gorse. Gorse is a spiny, yellow-flowered shrub introduced from Europe, where farmers had used it as hedging. In New Zealand's mild climate, with no natural enemies, it spread explosively across the cleared farmland, smothering pastures in dense, prickly thickets. To the farming community, gorse became the most hated plant in the country, a noxious weed to be sprayed, slashed, bulldozed, and burned at every opportunity. Governments declared war on it. Landowners were legally required to control it. Yet the harder the farmers fought the gorse, the better it seemed to grow. Spraying, burning, and bulldozing only cleared the ground and let fresh gorse seed germinate even more vigorously. The land that had once held one of the planet's most extraordinary forests was now a degraded, eroding, weed-infested battleground. And almost everyone had given up on it. Almost everyone. The man who saw something different in that hillside was a botanist named Hugh Wilson. This was no ordinary scientist. A brilliant, fiercely independent naturalist, linguist, and conservationist, Wilson had spent years studying the native flora of New Zealand in extraordinary detail, surveying entire ecological districts and cataloging hundreds of plant species by hand. He was also famously committed to living by his principles. He gave up using cars and traveled everywhere by bicycle, kept a beard that grew long and white over his decades in the bush, and lived a simple, frugal life devoted entirely to the natural world. He had no interest in money, no interest in recognition, and an almost unshakable faith in the ability of nature to repair itself if only humans would get out of the way. Where his neighbors saw a worthless, gorse-choked failure of a farm, Wilson saw a forest waiting to be reborn. That same year, 1987, Wilson partnered with a Christchurch accountant named Maurice White, who had quietly been setting aside his own money for years to create a native forest reserve to protect New Zealand's birds. White provided the funding and the vision of a bird sanctuary, and Wilson provided the botanical genius and the daily labor. Together, through the newly formed Maurice White Native Forest Trust, they purchased 109 hectares of weed-infested, marginal farmland on Banks Peninsula, land so degraded that the previous farmer had tried everything to clear the gorse, spraying it, bulldozing it, slashing it, and burning it, only to watch it grow back thicker than before. They named it Hinewai, and Wilson became its manager, a post he would hold for the rest of his life, eventually being joined by a small team of just a few full-time staff to care for thousands of hectares. Then Wilson announced his plan, and the community erupted. His idea inverted everything the farming world believed about gorse. Here is what Wilson grasped that his neighbors had missed. Gorse, the hated weed, was not the enemy of the forest. It could be its midwife. Gorse is a sun-loving pioneer plant. It thrives in open, bare ground and grows into a dense, protective canopy. And underneath that prickly canopy, Wilson realized, conditions were perfect for native forest seedlings to germinate. The gorse would shelter the young native trees from wind, frost, and drying sun, acting as a nurse canopy, a protective nursery crop. The native seedlings, many of them shade-tolerant, would grow up slowly through the gorse. And here was the genius of it. As the native trees eventually pushed above the gorse and spread their own canopy, they would shade out the sun-loving gorse below. Starved of light, the gorse would weaken, die, and rot away, leaving a young native forest standing in its place. Best of all, the strategy required almost no work and almost no money. No planting crews, no nurseries, no machinery. Wilson's entire philosophy was one of minimum interference. The forest, he believed, knew how to rebuild itself. His job was simply to remove the things stopping it, the grazing sheep and cattle that ate every native seedling, and the fire that could destroy decades of growth in an afternoon. Take away the stock, keep out the fire, and then step back and let nature do the work, using the despised gorse as its scaffolding. To his neighbors, it sounded like madness. They had spent their entire lives, and their fathers' lives before them, fighting gorse. Now here was this eccentric botanist deliberately letting it grow, and worse, suggesting it was a good thing. The reaction was a mixture of disbelief and fury. Farmers worried the reserve would become a giant seed bank, spreading gorse across their land. One local wrote a scornful letter to the Akaroa Mail, declaring heaven help us from fools and dreamers. The phrase stuck, and it became the label for Wilson's entire vision. On top of the public ridicule, Wilson faced a direct order from the authorities. Since gorse was a legally classified noxious weed, local government regulations required landowners to control it. Wilson was officially instructed to keep clearing the gorse from the edges of his property and from the surrounding pasture, in line with the rules everyone else had to follow. The very strategy at the heart of his project, letting the gorse stand, put him in conflict with the law. Wilson held his ground. He understood the regulations, and he managed the boundaries where he had to, keeping the peace with his neighbors at the margins. But at the heart of Hinewai, he refused to wage the war on gorse that everyone expected of him. He was betting his reputation and years of his life on a theory that the entire farming establishment was certain was wrong. If he was right, a forest would rise. If he was wrong, he would have created the largest gorse plantation in the district and proven his critics correct. So he waited, and he watched, and he recorded everything. What began to happen on that hillside quietly vindicated everything Wilson had predicted. Beginning in October of 1987, Wilson systematically monitored the vegetation, setting up survey plots and annual photo points to track exactly what was unfolding. He did not have to wait long. Freed from the constant browsing of sheep and cattle, native seedlings began appearing in enormous numbers beneath the gorse. A vigorous native pioneer tree called Kanuka erupted across the slopes, and native hardwoods pushed up through the gorse exactly as Wilson had theorized. In 1994, he published his findings in the New Zealand Journal of Botany. The data proved beyond doubt that, in the absence of grazing animals and fire, the regeneration of native forest was rapid, especially through the gorse and broom scrub. Year after year, the transformation accelerated. The gorse canopy that the farmers had feared did exactly what Wilson said it would. As the native trees rose above it and cast their shade, the gorse began dying off, replaced steadily by genuine native forest. Areas that had been solid gorse became closed canopy native bush. The reserve, far from becoming a gorse plantation, was becoming a living, breathing native forest, and doing it faster, cheaper, and more naturally than any conventional tree planting scheme ever could. As Wilson's data and the visible results piled up, the skeptics fell silent. The fool and the dreamer had been right. Perhaps the most telling sign of the shift was what happened with the neighbors who had once opposed him. One nearby farmer, whose family had sprayed gorse for 3 generations, had a helicopter treat a steep bluff and received a letter from Wilson gently pointing out that the spray had killed native plants growing there. The two men walked the site together, and the farmer came home astonished, talking about native orchids and other plants he had never noticed before on his own land. The encounter ended not in conflict, but in collaboration, with a parcel of that gorse and bush eventually folded into the reserve. Over the years, Hinewai earned the support of the very farming community that had once ridiculed it, and native forest began regenerating outward from the reserve into the surrounding valleys, carrying birdsong back to places that had been silent for decades. As the forest returned, so did the extraordinary life it had lost. Life rippled back outward through the entire ecosystem. The bush filled once more with the songs of native birds. The bellbird, the brown creeper, the fantail, the silver eye, the kireru, and the native falcon all returned in growing numbers, spreading outward from Hinewai into neighboring valleys. Emerald green jeweled geckos reappeared, darting through the regenerating bush. Streams ran clean enough to drink from. And as intensive pest control across the peninsula knocked back the introduced possums and wild goats that devoured native plants, the forest grew richer still. Today, the reserve is home to hundreds of native plant species, including more than 60 kinds of fern. Then came the discovery that stunned even the botanists. A small native tree called Pittosporum obcordatum, the heart-leaved kohuhu, had been considered locally extinct on Banks Peninsula for around 170 years, not seen since before the Great Clearances. Then it was rediscovered alive on the peninsula. Today, several of these trees, thought lost for nearly 2 centuries, grow right outside the window of Hugh Wilson's own house. A species that the destruction of the forest had erased had quietly survived, waiting, and returned. It became a living symbol of everything Hinewai stood for, that nature, given the chance, can bring back even what we believed was gone forever. From 109 hectares, Hinewai grew into something far larger. Buoyed by its success, the project expanded dramatically. In 1991, the trust purchased 870 hectares of the neighboring Otanerito station, and over the following decades, Hinewai continued to grow. Today, the reserve covers around 1,700 hectares, well over 4,000 acres, of gorse-nursed, regenerating native forest, stretching, as Wilson had always dreamed, from the mountain summits down to the sea. The reserve now contains 47 permanent waterfalls flowing year-round, fed by a landscape that once again holds and releases water the way a healthy forest should. More than 20 public walking tracks wind through it, and thousands of visitors come every year to walk through a forest that, within living memory, was bare and eroding farmland. Throughout it all, Wilson continued his work of minimum interference, living simply at the reserve and handwriting and illustrating a twice-yearly newsletter called Pipipai, named after the little brown creeper, filled with his own detailed observations and drawings of the forest's recovery. The reserve weathered setbacks that tested Wilson's resilience. In 2011, a fire likely sparked by lightning burned through roughly a third of the reserve. But true to Wilson's entire philosophy, the land healed itself, with the gorse once again leading the regeneration, and a few years later, the native vegetation had regrown vigorously across the burned ground. The lesson of Hinewai reaches far beyond one hillside in New Zealand. At its core, the deepest message is about trusting nature's own intelligence. The conventional approach to restoring a forest is expensive, labor-intensive, and controlling. Raise seedlings in a nursery, plant them in rows, weed around them, and protect them for years. Wilson proved there was another way. By understanding how a damaged ecosystem actually heals itself, and by working with natural processes instead of against them, he achieved more, faster, and at a tiny fraction of the cost than any plantation scheme could. He let a hated weed become the foundation of a forest. The forest did the rest. There is also a lesson here about the courage to be wrong in the eyes of everyone around you. Wilson stood alone against an entire community, against the conventional wisdom of his profession, and against the regulations of his own local government. He was mocked publicly and ordered to stop. He could have been completely wrong, and he knew it. But he had studied the land closely enough to trust what it was telling him, and he had the patience to let decades pass while the proof slowly grew. Real change, his story suggests, sometimes requires a single person willing to look foolish for a very long time. A botanist on a bicycle was told to kill a weed, and he refused. In doing so, he turned a dead, eroding hillside back into one of the richest native forests on Banks Peninsula, brought back birds and plants that had been gone for over a century, and showed an entire country that the thing they had been fighting could become the thing that saved them. It turns out that sometimes the most powerful act of restoration is not to plant, or to clear, or to control, but to understand what the land is already trying to do, and to have the courage to simply let it happen.